We're going to talk about first the history of the Big Book, how it came about. The early flying blind period, of course, was from when Bill and Dr. Bob met in May of 1935 until May of 1938. And up until recently, the only real story, the only real history or story that we had about how the Big Book was written was Bill Wilson's speech in the Texas State Convention in 1954, and where he goes through the whole process of how the Big Book came about. And that was where most of the history of the Big Book came from. And he starts off by saying, but we're going to let Bill tell his story part of the time here tonight. And he's going to tell his yarn. Of course, a yarn is a long, rambling story. Bill's famous for those, and one that is implausible. Bill starts off his talk with, I would just like to spin some yarn, and they will be a series of yarns which cluster around the preparation of the good old AA Bible. And when I hear that, it always makes me shudder, because the guys who put it together weren't a damn bit biblical. I think sometimes some of the drunks have an idea that these old timers went around with almost visible halos and long gowns, and they were full of sweetness and light. Oh boy, how inspired they were. Oh yes. But wait till I tell you. And Bill talks about the fall of 1937. He says, so in this late fall afternoon in 1937, Smithy and I were talking together in his living room, Ann sitting there, when we began to count noses. How many people had stayed sober, had stayed dry in Akron and New York, maybe a few in Cleveland. How many had stayed dry for that long? And when we added it up, it was sure a handful, I don't know, 35, 40 maybe. But enough time had elapsed on enough really fatal cases of alcoholism so that we grasped the importance of these small statistics. Bob and I saw for the first time that this thing was going to succeed, that God in his providence and mercy had thrown a new light into the dark caves where we and our kind had been and were still by the millions dwelling. And so Bill, I mean, he's got 35, 40 people that are drunk and getting sober now. And so he comes up and he says, I'll never forget the elation and ecstasy that seized us both. We were happily talking and reflecting, and we reflected that, well, a couple score of drunks were sober, but this had taken 3 long years. And there'd been an immense amount of failure. A long time had been taken just to sober up a handful. How could this handful carry the message? So Bill came up and he said, we need 3 things. We need a chain of hospitals, and we need paid missionaries to go out and preach the AA word, and we need a book of experience. Well, the Akron people weren't any too happy with anything that had to do with money, and all of that needed money. You know, they were like, Jesus didn't have a book, and the apostles didn't have offices and pamphlets, and we don't need any of that stuff. But he and Bob were together, so he got a meeting together. So exerting myself to the utmost, which was considerable in those days, we finally got a vote in that little meeting, and it was a mighty close vote by just a majority of maybe 2 or 3. The meeting said with some reluctance, well, Bill, if we need a lot of dough, you better go back to New York. There, it's where plenty is, and you raise it. Well, boy, that was the word I'd been waiting for. So I scrambled back to the great city, and I began to approach some people of means, describing this tremendous thing that had happened. And he goes on to say later, he said, and I worked all summer, and we didn't raise 1 damn cent. Praise God. So he goes on, and we're in May now of 1938. And this is what we're going to focus on, May 1938 till April of 1939, when the Big Book was published. And Bill started writing his story, because that's what the Big Book is. It's a story. It's what it says it is on the first page. It's the story of how many thousands of men and women have recovered from alcoholism. And so Bill started writing his story. And from then, this book of experience was so that we could pass on what we had learned. And it's what we do in AA. We pass on what we hear, and we pass it on from one alcoholic talking to another alcoholic, to another alcoholic, to another alcoholic, and we pass it around, and we pass it on. Now, if any of you have ever played the telephone game, where you pass things on to one from one to another, by the time it comes out the other end, it isn't always the same. And AA members, this is something that Arthur S., AA historian, wrote. AA members seem to have a warm place in their heart for AA history. The AA fellowship also has a strong verbal tradition. Much information is passed on by word of mouth. This is both its good and difficult sides. Begs the question, how much narrative is fact and how much is myth or error? History is not supposed to be statements of beliefs. It is supposed to be statements of fact. Much anecdotal myth circulates in AA and is erroneously accepted as fact. Unfortunately, assume the aura of facts when frequently repeated. The inaccurate statements such as Dr. Bob sobered up on June 10th, or no changes have been made to the wording of the Big Book basic text, permeate AA. The popular adage that repetition strengthens and confirms certainly applies to practicing AA principles. Unfortunately, it also applies to making myths and errors appear to be facts. So sometimes what starts out as one thing, by the time it gets passed along, and we have been playing this telephone game for 90 years now, passing it on from one to another, year after year. And then along comes writing the Big Book, The Creation of AA, in 2019. And it focuses specifically on this time period of May 1938 till April of 1939. And virtually everything in this presentation is taken from writing the Big Book. There are some other quotes, but taken from writing the Big Book with permission. And the basic premise of writing the Big Book is that the palest ink is better than the best memory. So we get some paper behind it. We're going to talk about primary documents and written things that are written down. Bill was interviewing Dorothy Snyder, Clarence Snyder's wife, ex-wife, and she says, well, this is switching back, but one of the things I feel vitally important is to get the story of how the book was actually written. We get so many distorted stories on the West Coast. People talk about the 100 men that wrote the book. Actually, there weren't 100, as Bill will bear me out. But he said 100 to make it sound good, as though it really was going to work. People talk as though they were 100 men that all went saintly and were taken straight up to heaven, and God just guided Bill's hand. That Bill just sat there and let the words come through. Actually, it wasn't anything like that at all. So in the beginning of writing the Big Book, it says, as a product of the late 30s, AA is almost unique among important spiritual works because of the tremendous amount of contemporary evidence telling us how it was actually put together. For the historian, the most valuable sources are the wealth of 1930s documents preserved in several archives across the Northeast. While these real-time documents provide the most unassailable evidence for what happened in Alcoholics Anonymous between late 34 and early 39, that history is further embellished by the later writing and statements of 4 early participants, Bill Wilson, Ebby Thatcher, Jim Burwell, and Ruth Hock. The word embellished is used here deliberately to emphasize the fact that each of these 4 major eyewitnesses has proven to be unreliable to one degree or another once their testimony is critically compared with the available archived materials. This should not be surprising. At best, memory is a defective and self-deceptive faculty. Attention is not always paid, and when it is, dates are regularly misremembered. It is a human tendency to modify memories so that they positively reflect later realities. We seem to naturally need to create a smooth story that fits what happened then into where we are now. So I want the history to agree with what I now believe, and that it doesn't always happen. This frequent lack of accuracy is found not only among these four most prominent early narrators, but also in the later recollections of early AA members. This is not to impugn everything that was said, but knowing how defective and creative memory can be demands that we check and, if possible, correct those errors. In short, any portrayal of the Big Book's history that relies solely on AA's well-worn stories is doomed to tell an inaccurate tale. So in summer of 1938, Bill's stories, plural, Bill started in late May 1938. May 20th was given. Bill begins writing Bill's story, and there is a solution primarily as promotion pieces to raise money to get into the wallets of the rich. And his first attempt wasn't a big attempt. It was called The Strange Obsession. It's 8 handwritten pages that starts out, "It was a hot night in the midsummer of 1934. And he was in Towns Hospital, and he goes rambling on about that and didn't care much for that story, so he put it aside and started all over again by saying, "When I was about 10 years old, my father and mother agreed to disagree, and I went to live with my grandfather and grandmother." So he starts off when he was 10 years old and tells his whole life story. And this is what's normally called Bill's original Bill's story. We're going to skip down to, he numbered those lines in it. Nobody knows why, but he did. And he's off to war. He heads over there into England, and he's in dear old England. Down there on line 222, he's in Winchester Cathedral, and he says, "Suddenly, in that moment of darkness, he was there. I felt an all-enveloping, comforting, powerful presence. Tears stood in my eyes, and I looked about. I saw on the faces of others nearby that they too had glimpsed the great reality." And all of this and more got edited before the final printing. So his spiritual experience in Winchester Cathedral got edited out. So now we're going to skip along to line 900 and some, where Ebby is going to come visit. Ebby says, "Nevertheless, here I was sitting opposite a man who talked about a personal God and how he had found him, who described to me how I might do the same thing, who convinced me utterly that something had come into his life which had accomplished a miracle. The man was transformed. There was no denying he had been reborn. He was radiant." Pay attention to these words now. I think you may have heard them before. "He was radiant of something which soothed my troubled spirit as though the fresh, clean wind of a mountaintop blowing through and through me. I saw and felt in a great surge of joy. I realized that the great presence which had made itself felt to me that wartime day in Winchester Cathedral had again returned." Of course, in the Big Book, the experience in Winchester Cathedral was edited out. So it says what happened in Winchester Cathedral, we don't know because it got edited out before it was printed. But anyway, the thing here is where Bill says he has an experience of the clean wind of a mountaintop blowing through and through him. Now, that should sound familiar because that's what he says about what happened in Towns Hospital. That spiritual experience got moved from when he was meeting with Ebby to Towns Hospital. This kind of cleared up a few things. Spiritual experiences usually bring sobriety, but Bill continued to drink for 2 weeks after that followed the cool wind of Ebby's visit. And so then we go to Towns Hospital, and where Ebby supposedly runs him through several of what became AA's 12 steps. So if we go to Bill's story again as printed today, we can count that Bill did about 10 of the steps of the 12 steps there in Towns Hospital. You know, he says, there I humbly offered myself to God as I understood him. See, that didn't come up later. That was right there in the story that he wrote in May. And nobody else invented that phrase. I admitted that I was nothing. I faced my sins and pain. I have not had a drink since my schoolmate visited me, and I fully acquainted him with my problems and deficiencies. We made a list of people I had hurt and resentments and willingness, blah, blah. And so in the story, in the big book, he says he did these steps in Towns Hospital. That is the only historical record of Bill saying that. In every other time that he told the story, which was probably thousands of times in his lifetime, everyone wanted to hear the story. And so he told it in recordings, in AA Comes of Age, in his autobiography that he recorded in 1954. He never says that he did the steps while in Towns Hospital. He never says he did the steps. But that he asked Ebby, he said, what was that little pat plan of yours, that pat formula? And Ebby explains to him what the Oxford group had taught him, the pat formula. And then Bill says, okay, thanks. And then Ebby leaves. Ebby told the same story. Ebby said, I called on Bill several times and he answered his questions. Never talks about making any list or anything else. So much for the historical summary of that Bill's original story. It originally had 11,454 words, and it was pared down to 4,529 words. So a lot of things got cut out, and a lot of things got compressed or moved around by Bill and by other editors in the process that we'll get to later. Let me tell you something else about Ebby Thatcher's visit. We know what it says in the big book. Ebby calls, comes over, Bill answers the door and says, oh, well, he looks different. And so that's what the big book says. Well, Ebby told another story. And Ebby said, Ebby says that he called, Lois answered the phone, and she invited him over to dinner a few days later. He came to the house. Neither Bill nor Lois were at home. They finally got there, and they sat down to dinner with Lois and Bill and Ebby and the girl who rented a room upstairs. And Lois asks Ebby, well, let's hear about yourself. And Ebby talks about the Oxford group until 1 a.m. And then Bill walks Ebby to the subway. Doesn't sound anything like Bill's story in the big book, but that's what Ebby said. And he told that story many times. And the story you read in the big book is a little different. He once glibly explained those differences by noting that, after all, he happened to be sober that night while Bill Wilson was drunk, pointing out that there were some details of that talk that Bill doesn't remember. But in the end, Ebby said, doesn't make much difference. The idea is there. But the story was completely different. Bill Wilson's version of the story is a parable, a mythic truth deeply embedded in his story of AA's origins, emphasizing the fact that it all started with one alcoholic talking to another alcoholic. No messy details, just one alcoholic talking to another, passing along the message of potential sobriety. And then there were the original 4 steps. There were never any 6 steps. We'll get to that later, but in his story, he talks about the 4 steps. If you look to the middle of the page there, step 1, Bill says, was, I turn my face to God as I understand him and say to him with earnestness, complete honesty and abandon that I henceforth place my life at his disposal and direction forever. I do this in the presence of another person who should be one in whom I have confidence. This was what they called in the Oxford group the surrender. Step 2 was, having taken this first step, I should next prepare myself for God's company by taking a thorough and ruthless inventory of my defects. Where have I failed? Step 3 required that I carefully go over my personal inventory and arrive at the conclusion that I'm now willing to rid myself of these defects and humbly ask God to take these handicaps away. And so we can see most of the 12 steps in this first original step. Step number 4 demanded that I frankly admit that my deviations from right thought and action had injured other people, and therefore I must set about undoing the damage to the best of my ability, make a list of persons I had hurt and disliked and those who had injured me, and make amends. So those were the original 4 steps that Bill had in his original Bill's story. And there is a solution. In June of 1938, there was also some evolution over the time. From June of 1938 until it was in the multilith manuscript ready to be printed, the word religious appears 13 times in June of 38, and the word spiritual doesn't appear at all. By the time of the book was published in April of 39, those numbers had changed dramatically. Religious only appeared, the word religious appeared only 7 times, and spiritual had replaced religious, the word religious, 7 times. So they were taking the word religious out and replacing it with the word spiritual. By summer of 38, June 17th, the first copies of these 2 chapters are sent out in an effort to raise money. Didn't work. They didn't raise any money, but at least they had 2 chapters going on, and so they would eventually take them to Harper Brothers. Where did the name come from, Alcoholics Anonymous? Around June, it was being used. Who came up with it first? Nobody seems to know. Hank Parkhurst was using it as the name, as a name, not necessarily for the book. Bill was using it. Of course, we know that in a solution, he says, we of Alcoholics Anonymous. So it was at least being used as the name for the fellowship. Shortly after that, he wrote to Dr. Bob that Alcoholics Anonymous was the name nearly everyone agrees should be used to identify the authors of the book, not necessarily the book. Lois in Lois Remembers says that on June 15th, 1938, the name Alcoholics Anonymous was used for the first time. Dr. Silkworth's letter of July 27th, 1938, Bill asked Silkworth to write about the success of their work. Now, as you can see, the original letter had Charles B. Town, was on Charles B. Town's letterhead and signed by Dr. Silkworth. It also mentions William G. Wilson. So, obviously that was modified to eliminate Bill's name. Also, opening the book with a statement from the chief physician at Towns Hospital might well have left AA open to the charge that it was endorsing Towns Hospital. And the same, a well-known doctor, chief physician at a nationally prominent hospital. So keeping it very generic and not mentioning any specific hospital or even physician. So by then they went to Harper's to see if Harper's was interested. They took the 2 chapters and And Harper said, yeah, we'd be glad to publish this. But Hank and Bill both wanted the book to remain in the fellowship, property of the fellowship. So in September, Bill was writing more about alcoholism and we agnostics, and were selling stock. Bill always says we walked into a stationery store, bought a pad of blank stocks, and wrote across the tops of them Works Publishing Company. Well, at that time, it was 100 Men organization, corporation, not Works Publishing. But and the deal was that Hank Parkhurst was going to get 200 shares. Bill was going to get 200 shares, and they were going to sell 200 shares to raise money for the book writing. And the drunks, they said, what the hell you mean you say you're only asking us to buy stock in a book you ain't written yet? So, but they did. Some of them did start buying stock. Hank came up with a prospectus around that time. You can see at the top of it, it's using the name Alcoholics Anonymous, so it was in use. But it is proposed that the 100 Men Corporation publish a book called 100 Men. So by this time, they were still thinking 100 Men was going to be the name of the book. Of course, then Florence Rankin joined, and that kind of blew that all apart. Just real quickly to go through some of the other chapters, October and November 1938. Working with Others was October to November. To Wives was written October to November 1938. To Wives was written 100% by Bill in drag, pretending to be a wife. It was never offered to Lois or to Anne Smith. Bill did offer Anne Smith to write a chapter by the wife of an alcoholic for the back of the book, for the story section, but he never offered it to them. The Family Afterward is in October and November of 1938. Lois always felt she should have written both. And, up until she was old, she said, I never understood why he didn't let him write it. And I was so mad and hurt. And as she said, I don't think I've ever gotten over it. Makes me mad just to think about it. And this was when she was much older. To Employers was written in November of 1938. Most historians believe pretty much that it was written by Hank Parkhurst. And A Vision for You was written in November 1938. So we got all of this stuff written and we still don't know how it works. But November 3rd, 3 more chapters are sent to Dr. Bob. Bill says, I'm turning this stuff out as fast as I can, being only once corrected dictation. You can't call it serious writing. After I get through with these general chapters on the present basis, I'll edit them as carefully as I can, bearing in mind the criticisms and suggestions from anyone who wants to make them. He wrote many times to Dr. Bob asking for criticism and never got it. And he used several times, he used the phrase, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. So we get to how it works it into action and in December of 1938. And here we go back to Bill's story. He says, so then came the night when we were up around chapter 5. As you know, I'd gone on about myself, Bill's story, which was natural, and then a little introductory chapter, there is a solution. And we dealt with the agnostic and we described it more about alcoholism. But boy, we finally got up to the point where we really had to say what the book was all about and how this deal works. As I told you, this was a 6-step program. Then, on this particular evening, I was lying in bed on Clinton Street, wondering what the deuce this next chapter would be about. The idea came to me, well, we need a definite statement of concrete principles that these drunks can't wiggle out of. Can't be any wiggling out of this deal at all, and this 6-step program had 2 big gaps in between they'll wiggle out of. Moreover, if this book goes out to distant readers, they've got to have an absolutely explicit program by which to go. This was while I was thinking these thoughts, my imaginary, this is the mental attitude that Bill's in while writing the 12 steps. My imaginary ulcer was paining me, and I was mad as hell at these drunks because the money was coming in too slow. Some had the stock and weren't paying up. A couple of guys came in and gave me the big argument, and we yelled and shouted. And I finally went down and laid on the bed with my ulcer, and I said, "Poor me." I mean, did Bill say 6 steps? Well, I'm going to do this quickly because I understand that you have the author himself coming to talk about this, but there is no written or recorded verified sources of any 6-step story or program are found until May of 1949, 11 years after the Big Book was written. There's no mention of any 6-step program in any of the personal stories, in any early documents, in the first edition of the Big Book, or the original manuscript. Virtually every historian agrees that that 6-step program did not exist. Ernie Kurtz says this formulation of the 6 steps was contrived by Wilson. Glenn Chestnut says there's no evidence that there was any formal set of 6 steps being listed and followed by people in AA prior to Bill writing the 12 steps. Just real quickly, you'll get a much better explanation, I'm sure, when Bill Shaberg comes to visit. But everyone says, well, what about the story, Earl Treat's story, where he says, Dr. Bob took me through the 6 steps of complete deflation and dependence on a higher power and everything. Well, that wasn't written until 1955, and it was probably written by Bill. Bill was responsible for getting many of the other stories for the 2nd edition himself, taping the experiences of old timers. And he and a guy named Tom Powers then edited those stories before they went into the 2nd edition. Even Dick B. Says that this 6-step was, Bill always says in yellow, he usually stated or implied that the 12 steps evolved out of 6 predecessor practices, principles, elements, or steps. He even says, we look at the personal story of Earl T. The language, Dick B. says, the language is not Dr. Bob's language. Complete deflation, that's, Bill used that all the time. He got it from, he says, William James. And Dr. Bob never referred to a higher power, at least any that Dick B. could find. God was God to Dr. Bob. And later on, Earl lived a long time after that, and never did he or his wife are ever quoted as making any mention of any steps. But anyway, you'll get more on that, I think, on the 14th is what I've been told. But anyway, so Bill goes on and says there was a pad of paper by the bed, and I reached for that, and I said, you got to break this program up so they can't wiggle out. So I started writing, trying to bust it up into little pieces, and when I got the pieces set down, I put numbers on them and was rather agreeably surprised when it came out to 12. That's a good significant figure in Christianity and mystic lore. Then I noticed that instead of leaving the God idea to last, I got it up front. So editing starts early. The next meeting comes along. I'd gone on about the steps, trying to amplify them in the rest of the chapter to the meeting, and boy, pandemonium broke loose. What do you mean by changing the program? What about this? What about that? This thing is overloaded with God. You got these guys on their knees. Step 7 said, humbly on our knees. Stand them up. These drunks are scared to death of being godly. So Bill says the argument started right away. It's amazing how recalcitrant and negative Akron and Cleveland were about the whole book. Dr. Bob got an old newspaper man, Jim Scott, and we're told the story that the Akron guys weren't writers. They needed Jim to polish up their stories. The truth was, aside from a couple of members, they didn't want to write stories. They didn't want to have anything to do with the book. Even AA number 3 refused to write his story for the book. Jim was sent to Dr. Bob to go have coffee with them one at a time, and he gets them to tell their story. He goes home and writes their stories. We have to mention a lot of the non-alcoholic people involved in the writing. If we talk about contributing, there were a lot of people. Lois and Anne and a lot of people were in the background. We don't know what Bill and Sam Shoemaker shared and how much Bill got from Sam or from Willard Richardson or from other people. But a lot of these people particularly even affected the final outcome of the book as we know it today. Just real quickly, a couple of them were Dr. Leslie B. Holman. It mentions a couple of psychiatrists, and these both worked for Johns Hopkins. The yellow says from Dr. Holman is mentioned on page 43 of the big book. It says one of these men, staff member of a world-renowned hospital. That was Holman. And Esther Richards, she also worked there. And after Bill talked to them, he went back and made a lot of changes to There Is a Solution. And their ideas affected the writing of the big book and the editing. One of the two most important editors of the big book was Tom Uzzell. He was given a copy of the raw manuscript by Hank to read and review. And so in 1938, there were about 65 members. At the time, Bill said later on, he said, we had a good deal less than 100 members. So in January 4th, Bill wrote to Frank Amos that the book 100 Men was nearly complete. So they're still talking about that as a title for the book. And Tom Uzzell completed a pre-publication manuscript and reduced it in size. He reduced the pages from over 600 to 400, 200 pages, to create a pre-publication manuscript. The cuts mostly came from personal stories. According to Bill W., Uzzell sharpened up the English, but didn't change much of anything excepting to take my story out of the story section where it had been the #1 story and insisted on using it to open the book. So Bill's story had been the first story in the back of the book. First his and then Dr. Bob's. And Uzzell said, no, you got to move it up to chapter #1 so that it makes sense. You tell this story and then you say there is a solution. Editing the manuscript, the New York stories. Hank did most of the editing of the New York stories. Made a lot of enemies doing it because these people didn't like having their stories edited. Bill claims that both he and Hank edited the stories, but the only changes on the manuscript are in Hank Parkhurst's handwriting. I'll give you one good example about how things really changed from the first version. Fitzmayu's story. Fitzmayu got sober in October, November of 1935. He was the second one after Bill came back from Akron in 35. First it was Hank and then it was Fitz. So he got sober in November of 1935. So he's writing his story in November he wrote it in May of 1938 about what happened to him in 1935. Okay. So here's what his original story says. He's in a hospital and he says, I'm playing bridge with 2 alcoholics and a drug addict. And a man comes up to me. The man asked, would I be willing to try to live on a new basis, to try to live up to ideals by trying to be absolutely honest, absolutely pure, absolutely unselfish, and absolutely loving in all my relationships. That's obviously the four absolutes of the of the Oxford group. And that's probably what Fitz was told in November of 1935 when Bill first talked to him. So that's what he wrote in his first story in around May of 1938. By the time it was published in February of 1939, that story now says, well, first of all, it says, I was sitting around playing bridge with three alcoholics, so they got rid of the drug addict. And then he says, the man came and he asked me if I believed in a power greater than myself, whether I call that power God, Allah, Confucius, prime cause, divine mind. He then asked me if I'm willing to right all the wrongs I've ever done to anyone, no matter how wrong. Am I willing? So this is the new program. But he's writing this as his original story. The original story started off with him being pitched the four absolutes, and now it's a completely different pitch by the time the story gets published. Some of this was part of Bill's attempt to eliminate any references to the Oxford group and its practices in the Big Book. The Oxford group had by this time, some negative publicity. People either loved it or hated it, and Bill didn't want this new organization to have Oxford group in its book of experience. The original manuscript has places where it's marked something was crossed off and it said it was too groupy. Also, the word surrender, that's kind of a big word in AA. It was also a huge word in the Oxford group. And so that's why the word surrender does not appear in the first 164 pages of the Big Book. It was an Oxford group big deal. And so surrender doesn't appear. And there were a lot of reasons why Bill did. Of course, in 1937, New York had already broken away from the Oxford group. And then there's the why don't you choose your own conception of God that many people like. It was added to Bill's story by Hank Parkhurst weeks before the Big Book went to print on April 10th, 1939. It was not a original part of Bill's story. It was added. You'll remember, despite the living example of my friend, there remained the word God around a certain antipathy. My friend suggested, why don't you choose your own conception of God? Those four little paragraphs are in Hank's handwriting in the multilith manuscript. Now, whether Bill dictated those words or what, or whether Hank just added them, we don't know, but they were not part of the original story. So we go back to Bill. Bill says we got around to January 1939. Somebody said, hadn't we better test this thing out? So they did a mimeograph multilith printing. They sent it out to preachers and Catholics and fishwives and policemen and everyone. And so they wanted to find if there was anything wrong or anything offensive to anyone. The idea is not to offend anyone who needs help. And so psychiatrists, doctors, preachers, the Catholic Committee on Publications, they sent it out to everybody. This is the second important editor. There was a guy by the name of Dr. Howard, a psychiatrist from Montclair, New Jersey. He recommended toning down the use of the musts. And he said, we ought or we should. Also, instead of the authoritarian word you should do this, you use the word we. Dr. Silkworth and Dr. Thibault offered similar advice, not to be directive, but to be suggestive. Just real quickly, some of you may have already seen this. This is from the original How It Works our stories disclose in a general way what we used to be like, then you are ready to follow directions. Say, so we got to get rid of that. At some of these, you may balk. You may think, this is pointing his finger at somebody and saying, you have to do this and you have to do that. You are dealing with alcohol. It's too much for you. You must find him now. Half measures will avail you nothing. And here are the steps we took, which are suggested as your program. And goes on, of course, to say this has been designed to sell you 3 pertinent ideas: that you're alcoholic and cannot manage your own life, that probably no human power can relieve your alcoholism, that God can and will. And if you are not convinced on these vital issues, you have to reread the book to this point or else throw it away. Well, that's a bit directive, a bit tough love, and we got rid of all that stuff. Well, Mark, if this looks familiar, this is a meme I stole from Mark. But anyway, all right, we know there are a lot of names being bandied about as names for the book. The most important thing is that Tom Uzzell, the editor, thought that their book should be called Alcoholics Anonymous. He thought it was a perfect title. There was a lot of people who wanted other names. The debate on the title went on heavily. And Bill said, I thought the title, The Way Out, was altogether too trite. And so, but they took a vote and The Way Out won. And Alcoholics Anonymous came in second place. So Bill and Hank were disappointed. So Hank planned an end run around it. He sent Fitz to the Library of Congress. And here is this is the wording of the telegram that Fitz sent back. This is from the GSO archives. And Fitz sent the telegram to Hank saying, no title can be registered in Copyright Office to secure a monopoly on its use. Stop. Library of Congress has 25 books the way out, not 12, as Bill always said. And he didn't want it to be number 13. 25 books the way out, 12 the way, 9 this way out, none Alcoholics Anonymous, none Comes Dawn, my pet. Stop. Our trip to Brooklyn definitely off. Business brisker, am writing, Fitz. So publication day, late March to April 1939. And early April, Bill, Hank, Ruth Hawk, and Dorothy Snyder traveled to Cornwall, New York to make the final edits to the big book. Hank has many suggestions for last-minute changes, but Bill makes all the final decisions on what goes in and what doesn't. So they wrote up there. Bill and Hank arrive, and they're up there, and they're proofreaders. But look at this, look at these pages that they've got all scratched up and scribbled, and they give this to the printer and say, print this for us. Well, the poor guy, he says, well, I can't do that. You've got to type it all over again. Now, Hank finally convinces them that, we'll be there and we'll check it as it comes off the press. So he finally gives in. Speaking to Bill, Dorothy said once, she said, I can still see you. You were reading parts and you'd weigh those phrases. Did this really say what you meant? Would it really help somebody? Would it offend this group, that group, or other groups? And after one of these discussions, Hank was sort of pounding at you that a certain phrase was too strongly put. I could still hear you say, well, I don't want the thing to be so insipid that they don't get the idea of what they have to do to be sober. So Bill, Ruth, and Dorothy bond with Hank and correct the printer's proofs. They spent the day working with the Cornwall Press compositors, and then they all had dinner together before turning in, and Knight produced a charming story about Bill Wilson and these 2 ladies. Now, I don't think I probably have time to tell the story of Bill Wilson and the 2 ladies in bed, but, well, maybe I do. Hank was fast asleep somewhere else in the hotel, but Bill was wide awake and he just couldn't sleep. He had a tray with a pot of coffee and cup in his hands, she said, and we were in a room with one big double bed, so Bill just got right in the middle, and there we were, and we talked the rest of the night, the three of us in that position. Their conversations wandered over everything, and the three of them just enjoyed that night thoroughly. Ruth Hawk said later that the night the three of us spent in the bedroom in Cornwall was one of the most satisfying and joyous memories of my life. How wicked that sounds, she said, but how innocent and wonderful it really was. So, April 1939, Ray Campbell designed the circus color dust jacket. He was given 4 shares of stock as payment. No, we don't know what the red dot is supposed to mean. He also designed an Art Deco style dust jacket. He wrote his story for the book, and in there he attributed to Herbert Spencer a quote, "There is a principle which is a bar against all information." Of course, it wasn't written by Herbert Spencer, but his story didn't make it to the second edition, but Bill liked the quote, so Bill, taking the quote in the second edition, put it into there in the spiritual appendix, appendix 2, spiritual experience, still with the wrong attribution to Herbert Spencer. Anyway, so on April 10th, 1939, 4,650 copies of the book are printed. 100 copies are delivered to Bill and Hank, with several more copies going to people of the Rockefeller Foundation. On the right-hand side, this is the first book off the press, and Bill wrote, "To Lois, one whose loving care and fortitude in our dark days together made these pages possible, so to her, this first book of the first edition is lovingly and thankfully given, Bill. In memory of, quote unquote, the 5th Christmas, 12/25/39, don't know what that means. It would have been his 6th Christmas sober. On the other one, he wrote in 1957, he wrote, note, this was the very first AA book off the press. We used thick paper to make the alcoholics think they were getting their money's worth." And of course, the first edition, first printing, had the doctor's opinion was on page 1, Bill's story on page 10. Why it was changed, only Bill Wilson knows. But now a word from our sponsor. We have an AA history only page if you're interested. We post AA history every day. We answer questions about AA history. It's not for opinion or discussion or chat, just AA history, only if you would like to join us on Facebook. In 2011, Time magazine included Alcoholics Anonymous on its list of the 100 best and most influential books written since the magazine was founded in 1923. The following year, the Library of Congress selected the Big Book for its list of the 88 books that shaped America. Despite never being on the bestseller list, Alcoholics Anonymous continues to be one of the best-selling books of all time. Over the years, it has literally been printed by the carloads, train carloads, and over 37 million copies have been sold as of 2019. The book, which had been translated into any impressive number of languages, still sells well in hard copy despite its ready availability online for free. Most importantly, however, is the fact that since it was published in early 1939, the Big Book has shown millions of people a precise and proven path to continuous sobriety through a spiritual awakening, allowing them to live sane, fulfilling, and fruitful lives without alcohol. We have no idea how many millions of recoveries have been affected by Alcoholics Anonymous since the book was published, but if an exact number were known, it would be staggering. And then multiplied by all of the families and friends that it has also, those recoveries have affected. AA currently reports the fellowship at around 2 million sober and active members. It was the writing and publication of the Big Book, more than anything else, that made all of that possible.